Right, welcome to the first and probably the only training video we're going to do. We're now going to show how to start the aircraft up from cold and dark. So as pilot flying, I get in and I need to establish electrical power to the aircraft. So first of all, we turn the battery switch on, which brings everything up and brings DC power to the aircraft. And as you can see, the battery is discharging. So at this point we want to get some kind of AC power source, which is normally either the APU or the ground power. As we've got ground power available, ground power switch goes to on, and then we get AC power to the aircraft, as you can see here, through the ground power bus. We've got 110 volts. So first of all, we do basically an initial cockpit safety check. So we start here. We're going to arm the emergency exit lights as the first item. We're also going to come down here to the chime switch and just confirm that works. So we've got communications back to the cabin. We're coming down to the flap lever, so we're just confirming that the flap lever is up and the flaps are indeed up, so that does actually tie up. We're then going to come back up to the overhead here and just do a stall warning check on both systems. And the same with an overspeed warning check on both systems. Again, we're only doing this because we're cold and dark. This isn't done during the transit. We'll come across to the service interphone, confirm that's on, that the reverser lights are out, and that the EECs aren't in a fault mode and they're both on. Come down to the oxygen. Passenger oxygen is normal, and we have oxygen for the crew. Coming across, while we're up here, we're flip the IRS mode selectors to align. Now we come back down to the main panel, so it's a flow going up and then back along. So we're checking that the nose wheel steering is set to normal, the clock is correct, the main DU selectors are in normal, the lights are in bright, and while we're here we do a quick light test. So we're coming on to lights, which is just to confirm that all the lights in the aircraft are in fact working. So at that point, that's our kind of initial cockpit safety checks done. And as we've put the IRSs to align, we will just confirm that we have got the GPS position set. So the ADRUs are aligning, and will take 7 minutes to align. Right, so now the first officer has joined us on the cockpit. Hello. Hello. He's completed his external walk around. So the next thing is we need to get the FMCs loaded up and our routing. So as pilot flying, that's my responsibility to start with. So what I will do is I will go to the routes page on the FMC. During world flight we will have all the routes ready to be loaded in by the FMC, but for now I'll put it in manually. So we start off with a departure, EGLL, put that in the top right, and arrival, EGPH, we're off to Edinburgh today, funnily enough. Put a flight number in, which always has to be Speedbird 37 Charlie, because that's what ACARS uses to update the website. And we're going to start off by putting a departure runway in, which we think is 27 left at the moment, so we just put one in at the moment as a good starter. And now we go to the next page. So first of all we're going to put the route in. Okay, so now I've put the cruise altitude in, just as the IRSs have aligned. I'm just finishing off what I needed to do, which is the cost index of 80. Or whatever we say on the flight plan. If we're running late, it's 100. If we're running early, we'll drop it down. Zero fuel weight, I've got off the flight plan here, which is 57.1. Goes in there, and fuel reserves for this leg are on here. Final reserve 1.2. 1.2. Okay, so now the IRSs have aligned, we come back here and we just set the mode selectors to nav. So the next stage now is both the FO and myself basically follow the same process. So what I'm doing is I'm setting up my EFIS, so I'm setting the mode selector to whatever I want, but it has to be map, the range to whatever I think is necessary. VOR selectors to I'm going to have 2 VORs tuned probably, so I might as well set those. I'm just confirming the minimums are set to Barrow, and I set that to airfield elevation plus 1,000, so that will be about 1,050 at Heathrow, 1,080.
Yeah, 1,070.
Chuck those in, 170. The Barrow selector is set to HPA, which is what we want it at, and the QNH is set to the QNH, which is 1018. Generally the captain will have weather on and the first officer will have terrain during the flight. And at this point I would just check the MCP is reset, so the speed is back to 0. We've got an altitude of 100 feet, so we know that we haven't actually set an altitude, and that just reminds us on the next step what we need to do. And I'll turn my flight director on, and the first officer will have done the same. Cool. Okay, so the next point I'll hand you over to Benny, and he'll show you what the first officer is doing at the same time as I was doing all of that.
Okay, so like Gary says, once I've come back out, getting all the load sheet, doing the walk around and the like. Once he started putting the information into the CDU, I started setting up my side. It's a very similar flow, so we start the EFIS again, make sure I'm on Barrow, got the MFRA set that side, flight path vector if you like it or not, meters if you need it, set the pressure to the HPA or inches depending where we are, and set it to the QNH 1018. Set the VOR and ADF switches to whichever you prefer. Map mode, generally you can have it centered if you want, or with the VSD, it's personal preference. The range, make sure that traffic is on, and then on the first officer's side you also have the terrain radar on as well, which of course will change as you go around and about. Then move down, make sure that our switches are normal and normal in both those positions, and then it's just a gross error check of the main PFD, make sure there's no flags you wouldn't expect, everything corresponds as you'd like. There's no autopilot annotations at the moment, that you're in the flight director mode, the heading syncs to what you'd expect, and so on. Move further down, set the brightness to whatever you like, make sure all 3 switches are guarded, then you perform a GPWS test just by pressing the button.
Don't think, sync rate, glide slope, pull up, terrain, too low, terrain, too low, gear, too low, flaps, wind shear, wind shear, wind shear.
I'm awake.
And that runs through all that. No doubt during some point a world flight we'll get to listen to most of them anyway. We then do a gross error check of the FMC, so we go on our side to the perf page, we cross-reference the 0 fuel weight from the flight plan that we've got here, and make sure all the information's correct, that we've got the fuel that we'd expect, the 0 fuel weight, the reserves, and basically it's just a massive gross error check to make sure the captain hasn't done any major error like put the wrong 0 fuel weight in, or we haven't got enough fuel. We then have done all the performance data for the takeoff for the runway that we expect, and we enter the D rate. So previously we've decided it's going to be takeoff 2 with a D rate of about 37 degrees. So we've worked that out, that'll provide us enough. We'd also check that the EPA that it's given it, or the N1 that it's given us, corresponds to what we've been expecting on the performance data when we've done it. Then go to the takeoff page and enter the information there. So it's a flap 5 takeoff, enter the V1, VR, V2 speeds, and make sure that they appear on the primary flight display as well. It gives us a stab trim, which we can generally ignore.
CFG is 27%.
Yeah. So there we go. So it gives us a stab trim. So we enter 27 CFG, which gives us a stab trim of about 4.38. So by pressing the system page, it brings up the system page here, and we can just set a stab trim of around about 4.37, which is near enough. And then I then go to the legs page, plan page, and going through the flight plan itself, you just basically go through each point and make sure each point matches up, the distances, the speeds, and everything that you'd expect. It's just a final gross error check, which I won't bore you with actually going through now. At this point, while I'm doing all that, the captain will have finished his side and he'll be doing the gross error check, or going through the overhead and making sure that's all configured for flight. So and just before we go to Gary, actually one more further item just to check. Once you've finished looking through the flight plan, just need to go to the climb page and make sure the cruise altitude, the speed transition and the transition altitude are all correct and what you would expect. You can also enter further speed restrictions. For example, if it's a really tight turn after departure, you may want to limit the initial speed. But that's all completed as well. And now we can hand over to Gary.
Okay, so now we're doing basically configuring the overhead for departure. It's quite straightforward. Start from the top left. So we're just checking the flight control switches are on and guarded. The alternate flap selectors in the off position. We've got no failure flags. Coming down to the navigation, both switches are in normal. Control panel switches are in normal.
And your damper on.
And the source is normal. Yaw damper on the flight controls page. Coming further down here, we're just checking that the expected flags are on. I'm going to turn the fuel pumps on, and we just confirm the low pressure lights go out and the filter bypass lights go out. And at this point, we just double check that our fuel on board is as expected, which it is. So we then move up to the second electrical panel here, confirm the galley power is on. These switches here is your personal preference. We're on ground power, and I just like to know that the battery bus is powered, so we can leave those. Coming down, that the drives are actually on and the standby power off light here is extinguished. If it was turned on, you just need to recycle it. We're on ground power. The APU is not running. If we were in a place where we had no ground power, obviously we check the APU was on bus at this point, and the EGT was still fine, but at this point we're still on ground power. Coming down the centre here, we're just checking the equipment cooling is in normal. We move the chime to off. Now this chime switch here we use as a signal to show the cabin is secure. So if we've had our call from the cabin to say it's secure, we put it in the down position. The cabin's unsecure, we put it in the off position. At this point, the fasten seatbelt sign should be on. The wipers are off. The start switches are in the off position. Down the next side, the window heats at this point go on. We just confirm we get an overheat light comes on and goes out, and the on is on. Probe heat stay off at this point. Just checking that we've got flags. That's expected that the captain's pitot is actually on at this moment because it's powered from, I think, the standby power bus. The anti-ice isn't required, it's 17 degrees, so we'll leave that off for now. And at this point we just pressurise the hydraulic system by all pumped into on. Coming further down, we're just scanning all the lights. The position light is on. Starting back from the top here, voice recorder in auto, trim air goes on. The air conditioning, we basically, if the temperature's between 5 degrees, +5 and +25?
-5.
-5, +25. We don't generally put the aircon on, but if we do want to, we can have the air conditioning on in auto, and we're powered from ground air, which pops into the system here. So as long as the isolation valve is in open or auto, both packs do have bleed air. The reset fans are both in auto. At this point the engine bleeds, they stay on, okay, and the APU bleeds off because we haven't got the APU. We just now go down here to the pressurization panel and set the flight altitude, which is 30,000, flight level 300, and our landing altitude, I believe, is about 50 feet, is it?
Something like that.
Yeah, so this is, yeah. And the selector in auto and the manual outflow valve selector is also in the middle position. Right.
Action.
Okay, so now we've done whatever we just did. Next thing is we just need to set the MCP up. So just to confirm, I've got a course of 358 because previously, while we were offline, we've set the course for the departure from Midhurst in the left hand side and Burnham in the right hand side. So I've just double checked that my EFIS is set to that. The course in the airspeed, I'm setting V2, which is 135. The runway heading, which is 273, and the initial SID altitude, which is 6,000. And I'm just confirming my flight director's on, and the first officer's flight director is also on. We may as well, while we're here, just come down. We're checking the auto brake is on RTO. The standby instruments are set to the correct Q&H, and just a quick visual check of the centre console. Okay, and now we just confirm that the MFD is in engine page, speed brakes down, the thrust levers are closed, the stab trim is set, the parking brake is set, the fuel control cut-offs are set to cut off, and these switches are in the up position, don't recycle them, and then we just check the TCAS is in standby.
Okay, so while Gary's been doing all the final checks, I've been busy doing all the paperwork, so made a note of the actual fuel we've loaded, how much extra over above, checked our zero fuel weight is what we expect it to be, and also that it's well within the takeoff weight performance for the aircraft. Also spoke to ATC, got a clearance for Woburn 3 Golf and the Squawk, so we're all set at this moment now for push and start.
Before the start checklist, to the line please.
Okay, the way the checklist works, I'm sure you've all looked very carefully, but all the items, some of them have stars next to them. The stars are through flight, so this is a start up from the cold and dark, so you do every item. On a flight where we're just going from a transit state, you only do the ones with a star. So today we'll go through them all, but normally you may only just do individual ones that are in there. The checklist, the most important thing is that all the action should already be done. A checklist is just a check of, rather obviously, to make sure that everything has been done. So all the items should be done, then you call for the checklist rather than going through the checklist and calling for an item and moving it. So we just start now with mobile phones.
Are off.
The IRS mode selectors.
Are normal.
Light test.
Has been done.
Oxygen.
Is there.
Yaw dampener.
Is on.
Nav transfer and display switches.
Are normal.
Fuel.
Is set 6 tons.
The cabin galley switch.
Is on.
Emergency exit lights.
Are armed.
Passenger signs.
Are on.
Window heat.
Is on.
Hydraulics.
Is set.
Air conditioning and pressurization.
Set.
Pressure mode selector.
Is auto.
Instruments.
Are checked, no flags.
Auto brake.
Is RTO.
Speed brake.
Down.
Parking brake.
Set.
Stab trim cutout switches.
Normal.
Radio, radar and the transponder.
All set. Just to confirm, the squawk code was
6042.
42.
Rudder and aileron trims.
R0.
We've done the takeoff briefing, which we can go through another time.
Yeah,
it's
we'll go
quite
through the
simple thing
briefing.
to do.
Yeah.
FMC and CDU.
Is loaded.
The N1 and bugs.
I've got an M1 of 84.1 auto. I've got a V1 of 129 and the V2 set.
Okay, stab trim.
Is set.
The cockpit door.
Is closed and locked.
And the doors.
Are closed, lights out.
And that's before step.
The load sheet has now been received, so Benny has just confirmed that the zero fuel weight is correct. What we now do at this point is start the APU. So all you need to do is, this is a real switch, so we just need to pull it out slightly, slowly to the on, and then push it down to start. Just hold it to the maintenance light, these lights come on, and then we put it back to off. And the APU will now go through its startup process, so the fault light goes out. Lower oil pressure is still on, maintenance goes out, it's done its self checks, the EGT is slowly rising, that will then rise to about 700 degrees, low oil pressure is now gone out, and shortly afterwards the APU will now be available on here. Right, so the APU has started, so we just move the APU gen switches to on, which takes the power off of the ground power bus. As you can see, it's flickering away there. So the ground power is now off, the APU is on bus, and now we just do the APU bleed air. We just turn that switch to on, and just confirm, and now we can actually call ground and ask them to disconnect the external power. Pleasing.
Action.
Right, so at this point we've just been cleared for pushback, so we're just going to do the quick checks before push, which is basically the anti-collision light is going to go on, if Benny could, thank you. We are then going to check that the transponder is set to standby. Because we're pushing back, we need to depressurise the A hydraulic system, otherwise the nose wheel steering will actually just break the tow bar off, so we will flick those to off. And we just confirm the packs are off, which they are. And I will now call for the before start checklist below the line.
So hydraulic A pumps
Are off.
air conditioning packs,
Are off.
anti-collision light,
Is on.
parking brake,
Is set.
transponder,
Is set.
before start checklist complete.
Please action. Okay, so we're now ready for pushback. We've got our clearance, ATC have cleared us, we've completed the checklist, so Benny now needs to contact ground.
And ground speedbird 37 Charlie, request push.
Go ahead.
That's 37 Charlie, push approved and face to the west. Okay, we've got pushback approval.
Set parking brake.
Okay, parking brake is set. Tell the ground go.
Parking brake is set.
Okay, so he's now connected his little tug up.
Okay, steering pin inserted. Please release brakes.
Parking brake released.
Pushing back.
Okay, so we're now pushing back. We don't do anything till we get engine start clearance from the ground. Blokey.
All engines clear for startup.
Okay, and we'll start engine number 2 first.
Yeah, so we are clear to start by the ground engineer. So what I will do is I will position the starter switch to ground, and I call N1 because the N1 is rising, and I call N2 because I see the N2 rising.
Alright, as soon as I see the oil pressure rising, I say oil pressure.
So I get to the max motoring speed, which is about 21, 22-ish, and I then put the fuel in.
At this point, I'm watching the N2 and expecting the start to cut out around about 56%.
All the time we're looking out.
Set parking brake.
Parking brake set.
Okay, towing system is removed. Please
Start to cut out.
Signal on your left-hand side. Bye-bye.
And he says start to cut out. I now hand the responsibility to the FO, so please monitor engine number 2.
Okay, and I'm just watching all the instruments, make sure there's nothing abnormality-wise, and as soon as the red line has disappeared that you can see on that one at the EGT, the engine has finished its startup, and I can say engine number 2 stable.
Pleasing. So now we do the same with engine 2. So starting engine 1, N1 is rising, N2.
Oil pressure.
Oil pressure has risen. So I now put my hand on the cutout switch, just waiting for max motoring speed, so between 21 and 22%. Put the fuel in. We've got a light up there, so the EGT is rising. And again, just monitoring all the instruments are stable.
Start to cut out.
Okay, monitor engine number 1.
So monitoring, just waiting, make sure, and as soon as the red light goes, the engine's finished. Engine number 1 stable.
Pleasing. Okay, so the engines have now been started, so we need to get the electrical system onto the engine generators. So to do that, we just flick the gens down, confirm the APU comes off of bus. We then move up here to the hydraulics panel and just confirm that the hydraulic pumps are now back on. As they are. We then come up here to the probes, turn the probe heats on, come over to the air conditioning panel. The APU bleed can now go off, and the packs can now come on, and the isolation valve now goes to auto. The start switches go to continuous, and then I blank the lower display unit in case there's any problems. It will then come up.
We'd also switch the
And now we're also good. The APU is now off of bleed and off of electrical bus, and we can turn the APU off. At which point I will call for flaps 5.
Flaps 5.
And now we're good for the after start checklist, please.
Okay, so generators
Are on.
probe heat,
Is on.
anti-ice,
Is not required.
hydraulic A pumps,
Are on.
air conditioning,
Is set.
isolation valve,
Is auto.
engine start switches,
Are continuous.
APU,
Is off.
recall,
One thing we didn't do, we should have done a recall before the checklist, so we just do that. And we're just checking. We seem to have a problem with the electrical system here. saying that we haven't done something. So we will recycle the galley power there, see whether that, and that is indeed it. Check the recall, so we just check that. Just check all the lights on both sides go out, different systems on both sides. And I'm just going to do a, where was the next stage?
Flight controls.
Flight controls have been checked. So just to confirm, you go to the sys page, just confirm the elevator, the ailerons, the rudders, the steering tiller are all working.
Okay. Flaps
are set to 5, and just to confirm, they just check that they are indeed 5.
Okay. It's stab trim.
And you can also double check up here to see that the leading edges are in fact out. Stab trim is set 4.3.
The engine start levers
are idle.
before taxi checklist complete.
So at this point, pilot flying, I'm now taxiing, and the pilot not flying will be doing the pre-takeoff checks.
So I just make sure the config's all correct. So everything is set up how we'd expect. Flaps 5, gear down, flap handle, everything does it. So flaps down. Final check of the fuel. We're also looking to see how much fuel's in the centre tank, because on a short flight today we don't have any. But depending if it's more or less than 453 kilos, and depending how far and above that, may dictate whether we put the centre fuel tanks on or not. In this configuration we don't, so they're just off. I do a check of the stab trim as well, just to make sure that that is correctly secure. Once we get the call from the cabin crew that the cabin is secure, position that switch there. As Gary was saying earlier, it's a quick visual check that the cabin is secure, and that's all the checklists done up until we enter the runway. At this point, when I'd said that I've done all that, the captain asked for the before takeoff checklist to the line.
Could I have the before takeoff checklist to the line, please?
So it's config, checked, flaps
Are set,
stab trim
is set.
takeoff briefing,
We've done that, you're happy?
and the cabin,
Is secure.
and that is the before takeoff checklist. So approaching the hold, we've been cleared to enter the runway and line up and wait. So I just do the final checks now, which start here in the auto throttle, or arm the auto throttle, and arm LNAV as well for the departure. Set the strobe lighting to on and the fixed landing lights to on as well, and that's just everything done. And then I quickly myself do the before takeoff checklist below the line.
Before takeoff checklist below the line.
So I said MCP is set, the transponder is TARA, the landing and strobe lights are on, and that's before takeoff checklist completed below the line. Gary's taxiing us onto the runway. The pilot monitoring, or the first officer, just puts the fixed landing lights on. The retracts are an indication that you've been cleared for takeoff. So those are touched only by the pilot flying. It's a gross error check, so we can both see whether we've been cleared for takeoff. So obviously with them in the retract position we haven't. But also similarly, if I see Gary reaching for those lights and we haven't been cleared for takeoff, it's a very good gross error check. So I'll just confirm with Gary we have just been cleared for takeoff by air traffic.
Been clear for takeoff. We're entering the runway, clear left and right, nothing on TCAS. We've been cleared for takeoff, so I'm putting the landing lights on and turning the taxi lights off.
And then what we're doing is an NADP 1 procedure, noise abatement departure. This one is you climb straight ahead, you follow the flight, and you climb up to 1,500 feet, maintaining V2 plus about 20. At that point, at 1,500 feet above the aerodrome, the thrust will reduce to climb power. Continue to maintain V2 plus 20 until 3,000 feet above the aerodrome. Then Gary will call for bug up, which is where we accelerate to the bugs up speed, and at that point we're going to VNAV when everything's configured. During the time that Gary's hand flying the aircraft, the pilot monitoring, or when the pilot flies doing it, pilot monitoring does all changes, configuration, autopilot. As soon as the autopilot goes on, he then becomes responsible for the MCP. But I'm ready if you are, Gary.
Yeah, so start timing.
Started timing.
And I advance the thrust levers to 40%.
So I'm just making sure all indications are normal, nothing down, and it's stabilised, indications normal.
Okay, set takeoff thrust where I hit toga.
And so as the pilot's monitoring now, that's all I'm doing is monitoring the engine instruments. So that's takeoff thrust set, indications normal. Of course, takeoff thrust has to be set by 80 knots, which is 80 knots, so we're well within that. Of course, Gary's very busy just looking at the speed and an actual increase in the altitude.
So I'm holding V2 plus 20 at this point, which is that light plug. LNAV has come in, we're turning right. Still holding V2 plus 20.
The climb thrust now is reduced. Gary's still maintaining around about that white bug speed. It's 2,000 feet. As you can see, there's no configuration changes done apart from raising the gear. Start to get a positive speed trend arrow. Okay.
For flat one, please.
Flat one.
And then once we're approaching the up speed,
yeah, so once the green arrows get into just about touching the up speed. That is my cue then to configure the aircraft after the takeoff.
VNAV, please.
VNAV. So it just start switches go off, RTO goes off, and the gear lever goes to off. And as we're climbing away, I'm just looking at the pressurisation, making sure we've got a clubbing climb. And then so initially in the climb, you're looking for a backwards L. So I don't know how well you can see it, but you kind of see it's just starting to formulate a backwards L.
I should have just called out there, we changed the VNAV speed, so I should have said VNAV speed. We've now gone to N1, so I call that.
Okay, so we're just a little bit further on in the climb. As you saw just before, we've been cleared flight level 300. Once ATC have cleared you through flight level 150, you can go to the N1 limit and select full climb thrust. And as you can see, it's about 20% with a massive thrust reduction. So you get quite a massive increase in thrust. So obviously it's worth just coordinating with the person flying. So he's going to have to pitch up quite significantly there. So we're just approaching flight level 100. At flight level 100 we do what's called a flaps check, which first of all stands for fuel. So make sure all the fuel pumps are on, fuel's flowing, it's kind of what we expect. If we turn the centre fuel pumps off before we took off due to the possibility of a warning, we may turn them back on, but we don't have any more of them. L is for lights, so obviously as we go through flight level 100, landing lights can go off, and just make sure the taxi light's off, the logo light is off if we've used that, so we should just have those three on. A is for APU, so we make sure the APU is switched off and there's nothing on there. If the APU is still on, you have to be aware that you may have done an APU takeoff, and that may affect the pressurisation, so you make sure that's alright. P is pressurisation, so we're just expecting the indications of where we would expect. We're climbing, the panel's set and there's no fault lights. Then the S is for seatbelts, so we can turn the seatbelts off, and we also turn the chime off as well.
And now I'm ready for the autopilot, so I will call autopilot command A.
And I press command A on the autopilot. Make sure I've got a command indication on the PFD. At this point, the roles and responsibilities change in that all the MCP is now the pilot flying. The only significant change that I make as the pilot monitoring is any lateral changes I do through my FMC. Any vertical changes are all done through the pilot flying's FMC. And that's about it now. We will continue to do that flaps check every 10,000 feet, so again at 20. speed transition is 250 at 10,000 feet. We then go to the climb page and change the transition altitude for Edinburgh, which is about 6,000 feet, I believe, anyway. It's something like that. We also look at the star chart, like the MSA and MEA and all around it, so we can see there's just aware that it's fairly mountainous around the area, so we're aware of that. We then go back to the CDU and into the legs page, and we'd cross-check, which we've done previously, so I won't go through each one. We'd cross-check that all the waypoints, all the restrictions correspond with the correct start and arrival chart. We then go into the fixed page, where we've entered Edinburgh, and we put in 3 rings here. The first one is 3 times your altitude, so 3 times 30,000 is 90 miles. The next one we put in is at 10 miles, and the last one we put in is at 4 miles. The general idea is the 90 mile or the 3 times your altitude gives you a gross error check for your top of descent. So you can see our top of descent is pretty much on the arc, so we know that we're pretty much on profile. The top of descent due to the start was well before that. We can find out we're going to be quite low on the expected profile. If it's well after that, we're going to be quite high, and therefore you might need to start thinking of speed management. The 10-mile ring is a bit of a gross error check. At around about 10 miles, you want to be, give or take, 3,000 feet at around about 210 knots, starting to bring the flaps out. If you're significantly faster, higher, or not configured at that point, it's probably not going to work, and therefore you're going to need some extra track mileage. And lastly, the 4-mile mark is where we'd, on a normal limitless speed approach, where we'd start to slow down. At this point as well, we'd tune the radios for the expected approach. So the ILS frequency for runway 24 is 108.9. So we tune that both sides just in case we need to auto land. And you can also see the course is 243, so they're both set that on our thing. The approach as well, we can also look at the runway length, where the exits are. So it's 2,500 metres long. The exits are fairly towards the end, so we can probably get away with about auto brake 2. So it's auto brake 2, and we'll also enter our VREF, flat 30 landing of 141. And lastly, while we're here, we'll set the minima. Find the minima page. So it's an ILS runway 24, Cat C aircraft. The minima is 540 baro. So Gary's going to set that very nicely, 540 baro over there.
To get the weather as well. And at this point, so that's our flaps check done.
Oh yeah, I've already done a pro.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
So we're up to Delta anyway. So that was the approach bit. We're now doing L, which is landing. So we just make sure we've got plenty of fuel for when we get there. We've done the VREF, we've done the auto brake. Everything's happy for that. We know roughly where we want to vacate, where we'll be vacating. So the T is the taxi. So just have a quick look at the Greyport ground chart. We're going to be landing 2-4, so we can expect to exit there or there. I think it'll probably be easier this one. We know there's no restrictions for our aircraft type on any of these taxiways, so we're happy we'll be vacating left, and then whichever one we vacate off we'll be turning left. And finally the apron, so where we can expect to be parking. So I can expect to be parking somewhere here, so we'll be entering Echo 1 or Foxtrot 1, and again there's no restrictions for our aircraft type around here, there's no major obstructions or anything like that, so that's our checklist complete. So just as we approach the top of the set, Gary will talk through that.
So we've just got a reset MCP out message. The initial restrictions, flight level 260 at Margo. So we just put that in and we monitor that VNAV does descend. We've got no ATC at the moment, so we want to clear those messages. Pause a sec. So, slight issue. Right. Okay, so during the, we're now in the descent. We obviously during the cruise have got the weather for Edinburgh, QNH 1013, and we've pre-tuned that. And now we're just cool at the, we should really have done this just before the descent, but if we can now have the descent checklist please.
Okay, so pressurisation
Is checked and set.
anti-ice
Is not required.
speed bumps
are set.
and VREF and minima
Are both set.
and that's the descent checklist complete. Okay, so we've just been cleared to altitude 4,000 feet, so we've done the approach checklist, which involves setting the altimeters to low pump pressure, which is 1013. Then we just do a quick altimeter check, so I'm passing 8,600 now.
8,600.
So they're both cross-checked, and we also cross-check the approach aids, so both are giving the correct ident, getting a similar DME, and so that's just the approach checklist complete.
So, and then I call for the approach checklist, please.
Which is the altimeters and instruments,
Checked.
approach aids,
Set.
and that's the approach checklist complete.
And the next zone. So you say localizer capture. Approach card.
Okay. At this point, Gary told me to set runway headings.
Set runway headings. Wait for the glide slope capture to come. At which point we do the preparation.
So glide slope capture.
Yeah. So if you could set go around altitude.
So it's at 3,000 feet, and at this point I do the landing checklist to the line.
Landing checklist to the line, please. Next, that's up. So he's got himself ready for the
Do that, and then go rest so engine start switches,
continuous
recall,
check.
speed brake,
He's on.
landing gear.
We're waiting. We're holding the landing gear.
So that's where we're holding it. So with it being quite quiet at Edinburgh, we're permitted to do 170 knots to 5, which allows us to keep a fairly clean configuration most of the way in. So we're just coming up to 5 miles now. So
If we could have gear down, please.
get down, flat 50.
Flat 15 and a flat 15 run speed is set.
Just went to 160. So gear and the flap obviously slowing us down quite nicely. And you're approaching 4 miles.
VREF plus 5, flaps 30 now.
30, and I've finished the landing checklist now. So the landing gear
He's down.
auto brake
Is 2,
flaps
are 30,
and landing lights.
are on.
Okay, and we're clear to land. So again, Gary does the retract brake to let us know.
So I'm now going to go manual. So the autopilot. And then Benny at this point would just clear the warnings that are flashing. They are.
1,000. Terrain.
Ignore.
50. 40 terrain. 30. 20. 10. Terrain.
Ignore.
Speed brakes up, reversal lights. 100.
Manual braking.
Manual braking.
60.
Go to the end. Okay.
So now we've landed, we just go, as the pilot flight starts touching the aircraft, we go through clicking up the aircraft. The transponder goes to standby. The trim is about 5 to 6 degrees nose up. Set the flaps to up. Make sure the speed brake has gone back down. Check the MFD, make sure the brake pressure is still above 2,800. Turn the auto brake off. Both flight directors go off. Set the IS to 900. Set the altitude to an odd number plus 100, so generally 3,100. Turn landing lights off. Flight cycling go off. Engine start switches go off, and the strobe lighting also goes off, and the probes go off. So that's just the aircraft all configured there. Now, at this point, we need to decide whether we're likely to need the APU or not when we get to stand. The general rule is if we're running extremely late or there's no ground power, we'll start the APU. If we're not running late and there is an expectation of ground power, we don't need to bother starting the APU. So, of course, Edinburgh being the forefront of aviation, it is, there'll be a ground power unit available. There we go.
And that was lunch arriving.
Again, we're just approaching the stand here. All we need to do obviously is turn off the taxi lights so we don't blind the ground crew.
Confirm the weather radar is off.
Yeah, the weather radar's off, and otherwise you won't be having children. And then at this point, Gary will just park us somewhere near the stand.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Parking brake is on. We just confirmed that we're just waiting for ground power now to become available.
It's just plugging it in now.
Yeah, so we put this onto ground power, and I can now cut the engines. We've got power sources available. We just confirm they start shutting down. At which point I can now do the start. Basically, is the preparation for the transit. So the seatbelt signs and the chime go off to show the cabin is insecure. The fuel pumps stay on. The collision light goes off. The hydraulic pumps stay on. The wing anti-ice and engine anti-ice go off. The air conditioning, we just turn the packs off.
Isolation valve.
And the isolation valve to open.
And that's all. And
we leave the hydraulics pressurised. Yep. The electrics obviously are fine. The fuel pumps can stay on.
So that's all there is to a transit shutdown. The aircraft's now in a pretty good state. Now just to have a quick turnaround and go back out again.
Cool.
Okay, so as we said earlier, you do the items, then use the checklist to make sure you've done it. So once Gary's done that, he'll ask for the transit shutdown checklist.
Transit shutdown checklist.
And then, as we said earlier, because we're only doing a transit one, we only do the starred ones. So it's electrical
is set.
Fasten seatbelts.
Are off.
Probe heat
is off.
Anti-ice
is off.
Air conditioning
is off.
Exterior lights
are set, just position light on.
Engine start switches
are off.
Auto brake
is off.
Speed brake
is down.
Flaps
up.
Parking brake
on.
Start levers
idle. Cut off.
Weather radar
is off.
And the transponder
is set to 2000 and off.
And cockpit door
is unlocked.
And that's transit shutdown complete.